Today we are fortunate to have Dr. Alex Tabarrok address us. Dr. Tabarrok is the Bartley J. Madden Chair of Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University and is also a professor of economics there as well. Dr. Tabarrok received his bachelor's degree at the University of Virginia, Canada, and his PhD at George Mason University. He is a co-founder of Marginal Revolution University, an online educational platform, and has co-authored and authored countless books, monographs, academic articles, papers, and the list goes on. Some of his articles have appeared in publications such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal, to name a few. His research encompasses topics such as the patent system reform, the effectiveness of bounty hunters compared to the police, how judicial elections bias judges, methods to increase the supply of human organs for transplant, the regulation of pharmaceuticals, voting systems, and much more. Today's talk is titled, See the Invisible Hand. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Alex Tabarrok.
Good job. Hi, thank you very much. Great to be here. Today I want to talk about the invisible hand. Now, to me, the invisible hand, which I think of as the situations in which self-interest leads to the social good. To me, the invisible hand is really the critical thing about economics, one of the absolute central insights about economics, what economics is all about. You know, other people say that economics is about incentives, right? You know, incentives matter, right? That's certainly true. Other people say, well, it's about sort of means ends, rationality, and maximizing preferences, subject to a budget constraint, things like that. And that's true as well. But psychologists understand quite a bit about incentives. Engineers understand lots about maximization of functions. But it's really economics alone which studies the invisible hand. It's not called the invisible hand for nothing. It's called the invisible hand because it's hard to see. And it's really only economists who see the invisible hand, who understand the situations in which self-interest leads to the social good, as well as the conditions with which that are required for that symmetry to occur, for that synergy to occur. So, of course, especially since we are at Adam Smith Week, it is also especially appropriate to talk about the invisible hand, which Adam Smith, of course, coined the term. So let's begin with an example. You've heard many times, no doubt, that economics is the dismal science. I want to convince you also that it's the romantic science. Okay? So let's begin with the scene. It's February. It's Chicago. It's snowing outside. It's cold. And yet here we have our handsome young man, and he is about to deliver some roses to his Valentine's Day sweetheart. Now, where do these roses come from? On a typical Valentine's Day, there'll be 180 million roses will be delivered. And there aren't nearly enough greenhouses in the United States to produce that many roses. So where do these roses come from? Turns out they come from all over the world. They come from places like Ecuador, especially for the US market. They come from Kenya. There's a large flower industry, especially for the European market. And when these roses are first cut in the fields, they're quickly put onto refrigerated trucks. They are driven straight to the airport. And then they are flown, often not directly, but often to a small town in Holland, to Aalsmeer, Holland. Now, what's in Aalsmeer, Holland? So in Aalsmeer, Holland is the Bloemenveiling. And the Bloemenveiling is the world's largest commercial building. It is 250 acres, all under one roof. And every single day, millions of flowers, millions of dollars worth of flowers are delivered from all over the world to Aalsmeer, and they are put on one of these 135,000 carts. These carts are lots, and these carts are paraded before giant clocks. Clocks which read not time, but prices. these clocks are an auction, and they start off at a really high price, and then very quickly the clock gets lower, 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 the price falls, 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 until somebody pushes a button and says, yeah, I want to buy at that price. These types of auctions where the price starts out high and falls lower are called Dutch auctions because they originated in Holland. So these flowers are quickly sold in these Dutch auctions. They are then put on further planes, and then they are delivered to one of the 50,000 or so florists and supermarkets in the United States, including the one in Chicago, where our handsome young man is able to deliver these roses at reasonable prices, having just a day or two earlier been in the fields in Kenya or Colombia or someplace, or Ecuador or someplace like that. It's really an incredibly amazing process. And what's especially amazing about it is that nobody understands all of the details of the process, and yet everything, as we'll discuss, is coordinated to make this process run smoothly every Valentine's Day. We also learned something else about this process, and that is that markets are cooperative. Right? We often hear when we're teaching markets all about competition, right? All about selling at a lower price or outcompeting the other guy or doing some deal or something like that. Markets are also cooperative. So you can see in this example, really hundreds of thousands of people are involved in delivering these roses on a Valentine's Day. People from Ecuador, people from Holland, people from Chicago, they're all cooperating voluntarily on the basis of self-interest. Okay? As Adam Smith said, it's not from the benevolence of the florist that you get your flowers, but from regard to their self-interest. So all these people are cooperating on the basis of their self-interest and without coercion and without central plan. It's really kind of an amazing thing. We see this elsewhere in the world as well. So take a phone. Many of you have one. Hopefully you're not looking at it now. Okay? You take any phone, right? Any smartphone like this, and ask the question, where was it produced? Right? The only possible answer you can actually get, it was produced in the world. Right? So you take an iPhone designed in California. It has parts from New York, parts from Texas, parts from Kentucky, has raw resources from Inner Mongolia, okay? Got parts from Korea, Taiwan, France, Italy. It's assembled in China. It's really a world phone. Even simple products like roses involve cooperation around the world, and when you come to a complex product, it's multiplied 10 times. It's all about seeing the world in a kind of a new way, seeing ordinary things and asking, what's behind that? Right? So take again a very ordinary situation. Here we have a veritable cornucopia, right? A literal cornucopia of grapes from Chile, pineapples, perhaps from Brazil, figs and apricots from Turkey, right? Products from all over the world right here at our fingertips. And what do we call this? What do we call this place? It's a very appropriate name. We call it a supermarket, right? It really illustrates, okay, how incredible, how amazing, how supermarkets are, that we have this immense amount of cooperation all to deliver these products. And nobody even thinks about it, right? You don't get up in the morning wondering whether the supermarket will have grapes or pineapples or any of the other myriad goods which you may be interested in buying. You just go and it's there. It's there. Okay? Paris is fed, right? It's just kind of a process which occurs in the background, but sometimes it's worthwhile thinking a little bit more deeply about that process. Markets are also creative. I'm actually going to move, and they're connected. I'm going to move forward through this, and I'm actually going to, if we have our technology right, show you a video on this question, which, let's see, here we go. Hopefully this will be fun.
A modern economy depends on the cooperation of vast numbers of strangers. But how is this cooperation coordinated? Let's revisit the economics behind roses. But this time, let's go back to 1973. In the 1970s, the price of oil skyrocketed. So it made sense to economize. But oil has many uses. So which uses should we cut back? And which should we maintain? In a market economy, no one person decides these questions. Or perhaps more accurately, everyone does. A price is a signal wrapped up in an incentive. So when the price of oil increased, it signaled that oil had become more scarce. And it gave everyone an incentive to listen to that signal. It said, find ways to economize on oil or develop substitutes, and you will profit. When the price of oil first increased, most roses bought in the United States were grown in greenhouses in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. The increased price of oil meant that it cost more to heat those greenhouses, which meant a shift upwards in the supply curve for flowers and an increase in the price. The result was that it encouraged people to turn to substitutes, such as chocolate and teddy bears, to give to their loved ones at Valentine's Day. But the story doesn't end there. Seeing the higher price of oil, entrepreneurs began to think about other ways to produce flowers. Instead of heating a greenhouse, why not use the natural heat of the sun and transport the roses? Entrepreneurs encouraged farmers in Kenya and Ecuador to start growing roses, and they began to invest in a new global infrastructure to deliver roses around the world. Who could have predicted that one way of adjusting to a reduced supply of oil was greater consumption of chocolate, and another way was by importing roses? In fact, no one could have predicted, let alone planned, all the myriad ways in which people responded to the increased price of oil. That's because no one knows all the information that the market uses. Everything from the cost of growing greenhouses, to the demand for roses versus chocolate, to the value that a particular piece of land in Kenya has for growing flowers versus coffee. No single individual knows all of this information. It's dispersed. So when oil becomes scarce, we want people all over the world to use this dispersed information, their information, and their ingenuity to figure out how best to economize on oil. The price system does this in a remarkably efficient way. The Kenyan farmer doesn't have to know anything about oil to have an incentive to do the right thing. He just sees that the price paid for roses is increased. And so following his self-interest, he starts to produce more roses. Ultimately, that frees up more oil to be used in the production of jet fuel, where there are fewer substitutes. Millions of decisions like this, made all over the world, rearrange and reallocate the world's production, taking oil from where it has low value and moving it to where it has high value, so that we produce the most value from our limited resources. That is the invisible hand in action. If it had been invented, the price system would be one of the most amazing creations of the human mind. But like language, it wasn't invented, and it worked long before anyone had any understanding of its principles. As Nobel Prize-winning economist Vernon Smith has put it, the pricing system is a scientific mystery as deep, fundamental, and inspiring as that of the expanding universe or the forces that bind matter. We'll be exploring more about the mystery and the marvel of the price system in the next video.
Okay.
If you want a 10.
So let me just figure this out. 1 second. Here we go. Great. All right. So a price is a signal wrapped up in an incentive. And both of these aspects are important. When any time one price changes, that signals entrepreneurs to take all kinds of different actions. That changes other prices in the economy, and the entire structure of the economy can change. So when the price of oil went up, right, how flowers were produced changes, how cars are produced changes, everything begins to change. And this is how the price system is working all of the time in order for us to get the most out of our limited resources. And the fact that this system, the invisible hand, the price system, the fact that it wasn't designed, but that it evolved without anyone's conscious knowledge is incredibly important. This is why it's important that economists see the invisible hand, see the situations and the conditions under which self-interest leads to the social good, because those conditions are the ones which make civilization possible. If it were not for the invisible hand, civilization would simply not be possible. So it's incredibly important to understand these conditions and situations. One of the best ways we can understand the price system is to understand what happens when the price system is impeded. What happens when the price system is not allowed to do its work. So let's begin with a simple situation with the price system, when the price system is working. Suppose that over here on the east coast of the United States, suppose they're having a really harsh winter. Okay? Well, over here, have I got that right? Yes. No, I'm sorry. Yes, over here on the east coast. Okay, yes, get this right. Over here on the east coast, we're having a really harsh winter, and over here on the west coast, okay, it's nice and sunny and so forth. Because of this harsh winter on the east coast of the United States, there's going to be a high demand for home heating oil. Okay? And what is that going to do, that high demand for home heating oil, what is that going to do to the price of heating oil over here on the east coast? It's going to push it up, right? It's going to increase the price. Okay? Now, seeing a high price for home heating oil over here on the east coast and a low price on the west coast, what are entrepreneurs going to do? Right, okay. What do entrepreneurs do? Buy low, sell high. Right? Buy low over here on the west coast, sell high over here on the east coast. And as they buy low, pushing up the price, and sell high, pushing down the price, you're going to reach an equilibrium. So what entrepreneurs are doing is taking oil from over here on the west coast, where it's nice and sunny, where oil has low value, and they're moving it over here to the east coast, where oil has high value. So what entrepreneurs are doing, they're taking resources from where they have low value and moving them to where they have high value. In this way, alleviating the shortage, alleviating the problem. Okay? Now, let's think about price controls. Okay? I'm sure in your microclass you've already looked at a number of different effects of price controls. So you know that they create shortages. You know perhaps they create reductions in product quality. Excuse me. You know they generate wasteful lines and other search costs. There's a loss of gains from trade, a deadweight loss. Okay, I'm sure you've looked at all of these, all of which have to do with looking at a single market in isolation. Okay? This is what happens in the single market in isolation. Another thing which price controls do is they misallocate resources. Okay? This is the one which a lot of people miss, okay? And that's the one I'm going to focus on now. The misallocation of resources, okay, caused by price controls. Okay? So now let us go back to the same situation we had before. We now have a really harsh winter over here on the east coast, a high demand for heating oil, nice sunny over here, okay? But now suppose we have a price control in place, okay? A price control on oil, okay? We have this really high demand for heating oil. But what's the problem? Is that going to push the price of oil up? No. Why not? Because of the price control. Okay? With the price control, the people who are cold on the East Coast, they can no longer signal their demand for heating oil. Okay? When the price of oil isn't pushed up, do entrepreneurs now have an incentive to take oil from where it has low value and move it to where it has high value? No. There's no incentive any longer. Okay? You used to be able to buy low, sell high, but now when you can't push that price up, there's no longer an incentive to move the oil to where it has really high value. This actually happened. So in the 1970s, 1973 in particular, was a really harsh winter, exactly like I'm describing. And there was a price control on oil, and people were literally freezing in their homes on the East Coast of the United States. They could not get enough oil to heat their homes. Well, at the same time, people on the West Coast were using heating oil to heat their swimming pools. So you had a misallocation of resources because resources were being used where they had low value to heat swimming pools at the same time when there wasn't enough resources in places where the oil had really high value to heat homes. So a price control, in addition to those other effects, creates a misallocation of resources. So this is this is what happens when the invisible hand is not allowed to work. Okay. This is what happens when the invisible hand is impeded. Prices signal and they incentivize. Okay. One can begin to read into prices. When you see changes in prices, you could then begin to read actually what is this price signaling? What is it telling us? Okay. So I want to give you a few examples. So this was from a few years ago. There's a headline, cold temperatures drive higher prices at the pump. So these news organizations were reporting that cold weather was increasing the price of oil and related products such as gasoline because there was a demand because it was cold and price was going up. At the very same time, just a day before, the Wall Street Journal had a headline, oil futures, crude oil falls as temperatures rise. Actually, to be more specific, what the Wall Street Journal headline was saying was that the futures price of oil, which is the price for oil to be delivered 1 month in the future, 1 month from now, that futures price was falling because of expectations of warmer weather. Okay? So you could look at the price of heating oil, see, in this case, that the futures price was below the current price, say, the market is expecting temperatures are going to warm up. Okay? Now, more generally, this actually works incredibly well. There's a famous paper, one of my favorite papers, by Richard Roll. And Richard Roll looked at the information content, okay, of the futures price of orange juice. Now, a key factor which determines the futures price of orange juice is going to be the weather in Florida. Huge amount of oranges are produced in Florida. Okay? So if the weather in Florida is expected to be really good, what happens to the futures price of orange juice? Falls. It falls, right? And if the weather is expected to be really bad, you see a higher futures price. Because if you expect really bad weather, right, then you expect a small crop. And with a small crop, reduced supply, you expect a higher price. Okay? Some of you may have seen Trading Places, Eddie Murphy, all involves futures prices and stuff like that. That's kind of what's going on in this movie, in that movie. Okay, so what Richard Roll asked is, can we use the futures price of orange juice to help predict the weather in Florida? And he found out the answer was yes. In fact, he went one step further than this. And he said, if we already know the forecast from the National Weather Service, okay? So we already have all of the science which goes into forecasting the weather in Florida, all the supercomputers, okay? We already have the National Weather Forecast, okay? Is there information in the futures price of orange juice which helps us predict the weather in Florida above and beyond the prediction we already have from the National Weather Service? And the answer was yes. Okay? There's information in the price of the orange juice futures which adds to the forecast from the National Weather Service. Okay? Pretty amazing that you can use the price of orange juice to help predict the weather in Florida, but it's true, you can. So this idea of the use of information in markets has been extended. I like to call this moving from Hayek to Hansen. Okay? So Friedrich Hayek wrote a very famous paper called The Use of Information in Markets. He was one of the first to really understand this idea of prices signaling, okay, as well as incentivizing, and to understand that prices were really information. Prices are information. Okay? So Hayek wrote about the use of information in markets. More recently, people like my colleague, Robin Hanson, have talked about designing markets in order to produce information. So the examples we've given so far are where the information is a byproduct of the market. Okay? People aren't trying to create a prediction of the weather, right? The people who are trading orange juice futures, they're not trying to predict the weather. Okay? But that information is a byproduct of their trades. What Hansen said is, let's create a market whose purpose is to generate information, is to aggregate all of this dispersed knowledge and produce some information which we would like to know. Okay? So this is the most famous example of these are the prediction markets, okay, which have become very well used now, in particular to predict election outcomes. So I'm going to use an old election outcome so I don't take any political position. Okay? But here's how these markets work. And you can go and trade in these markets right now. Okay? Anybody in the world can trade in these markets. And here's how they work. In 2008, you could buy an Obama share, okay, or you could buy a McCain share. These were the presidential candidates at the time. An Obama share is simply an asset which pays $1 if Obama wins the election. Nothing otherwise. A McCain share pays out $1 if McCain wins the election, nothing otherwise. Now, suppose that you thought that Obama had a 75% chance of winning the election. And an Obama share pays out $1 if Obama wins. What's the most that you would be willing to pay for an Obama share? Shout it out.
Less than $1.
Less than $1, for sure. Probably 75 cents, right? Okay? Because that would be the expected value, and if we weren't too worried about risk, for just $1. Okay? If you think that Obama has a 75% chance of winning the election, and this thing pays out $1 if Obama wins, then an Obama share is worth about 75 cents. Okay? The great thing about that is what that means is that the prices of these shares can be interpreted as probabilities. Okay? And in fact, at the time, August 8, 2008, an Obama share went for 63 cents, a McCain share for 37 cents, indicating that markets were expecting that Obama had about a 63% chance of winning the election, and McCain about a 37% chance. Okay? The amazing thing about these markets, which have now been operated for over 20 years, is that they predict election outcomes better than do polls. So if you want to find out what's the chance of what's going to happen in the election, the best thing you can do is to look at the prediction markets. There are now lots of these. So here, for example, as it loads up, let me see. Let's look here. So here's the data. It's not, okay, why? Okay, so we have an old browser here, so it's not giving me the picture. Hold on, let me look at something. Let me pull up something else just to quickly go. So let's go Iowa election markets. I'll just jump to a different page. This should probably work. Let's see if it works. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So here is from the Iowa election markets. It gives you what are the predicted probabilities. So right now, for example, on the Republican side, Donald Trump is ahead at just over 80%. Okay, so you can buy a Trump share for like 82 cents, something like that. And down here is a Kasich and a Cruz, okay, much lower. You can then go and look at, that's for the nomination. If you look at the winner-take-all market, who is expected to win? Okay, the Democrats are expected to win way ahead of the Republicans. So the Democrats are now expected to win about a 65% to 35% chance for the Republicans to win. So the markets are predicting a Democrat win. And the nice thing about these things, these predictions, okay, is they're available 24 hours a day, unlike a poll, okay, which you have to take every few weeks or something like that. Okay, they respond virtually instantaneously. So Donald Trump says something totally crazy, and his probability goes up, unfortunately. Well, that's been the way it's been going. But you can see, my point is, you can see how events change these probabilities. Who does well in the debates? If you want to understand who did well in the debates, go and look at the prediction markets. Okay? Did that actually change our best possible forecast of who might win the election? Okay? So these prediction markets harness the amazing ability of markets to aggregate and summarize information. Okay? And although they're not miraculous, they're certainly not perfect, they tend to outperform other prediction mechanisms, such as polls or expert opinion. Okay? Don't read the pundits, the newspapers say, oh, I think, that Kasich is there's going to be a brokered convention, Kasich is going to win, something like that. Okay? Go and look at the prediction markets. You're much more likely to get an accurate prediction. Okay? And these markets have now been created in all kinds of things, not just election winners, but whether Britain will exit the euro, Brexit, so-called Brexit. You can look at what's the probability of that. Who's going to win an Academy Award? You can look at predictions markets in that. In fact, there's a whole stock exchange called the Hollywood Stock Exchange, which does nothing but trade in which movies are going to have big box office. What happens, for example, when a movie which is in early production, what happens if they suddenly announce that we have Julia Roberts has agreed to star, and you see, oh, the price of that movie, goes way up. Okay? So you can see what's the value of a star. Okay? And in fact, Hollywood uses these data from the Hollywood Stock Exchange in order to figure out, well, what's the best way to make this movie? What's the value of having this star as opposed to this star? Okay? Bond traders, people who are interested in figuring things out, they'll go to the prediction markets. Firms will create prediction markets. Are we going to make this year's sales quarter? Okay? Which product is going to sell best? Okay? And they have people trade in this question. Okay? So these are often the best ways of making a forecast. Okay. I want to turn now to a different area. Because the idea of the invisible hand really is throughout economics. It has applications throughout economics. So I want to give you a quite different application, probably something you've seen part of it before. So no doubt you've studied how a firm in a competitive market maximizes profits. Okay? So we know what a firm in a competitive market wants to do to maximize profits. It wants to produce so long as the price of the product that it's selling is bigger than marginal cost. So the firm is continually asking itself, okay, what's the price? What's my marginal cost? If price is bigger than marginal cost, oh, that's a profitable unit to produce. I should produce that unit. So they keep producing until the point where price is equal to marginal cost, and that's the profit maximizing condition. Okay? I'm sure you've all seen that. P equals MC is a condition which a firm requires to maximize profits. Okay, I want to look at why is that really important. Okay. To do that, I'm going to start with a very different problem. Something which looks quite different. Suppose you're a central planner. Okay. You are the farm czar. You're in charge of collective farming in the old Soviet Union. Okay. And you want to allocate corn production across these two farms in order to maximize production at the lowest possible cost, in order to minimize your cost of production for any given quantity of production. Okay? So you're given this problem, and suppose that you know the marginal cost on farm 1 is here and the marginal cost on farm 2 is as given. Okay? And you want to allocate production across the two farms, okay, in just that way to minimize your total costs. Okay? You want to produce so many units, and you want to produce those units at the lowest possible cost. And the question is, how do you allocate production across the two farms to do that? Okay. Well, just taking a quick look at this, you might say, well, this is easy because the marginal cost of production on farm 2 is everywhere below that on farm 1. That is, for any quantity, the marginal cost on farm 2 for that quantity is lower than the marginal cost on farm 1. So the first thing you might guess is, well, maybe we should produce all units on farm 2 since the marginal cost there is lower. Okay? Now we can figure out whether this is true or not, okay, by just remembering that the marginal cost curve, okay, can be read as the cost of producing the qth unit. Okay? So if we're producing 200 units, the height of the marginal cost curve at 200, that's the cost of producing that 200th unit. Okay? That marginal unit, the 200th unit. Okay? So let us suppose we do as I just suggested and produce all 200 units on farm 2. Okay? Can you see a way to reduce our total cost of production? Is this the least cost way of producing 200 units? No. Okay, why not? Who said no? I don't want to pick on you too much, but who said no?
No, because you can produce at least, there's 25 there, but up until that cost of the first couple on farm 1 is cheaper than the 200 on farm 2.
Exactly right. Okay, exactly right. So suppose that we were to produce 25 fewer units on farm 2. So our costs would fall by area A. Okay. Now, of course, now we're only producing 175 units, okay? So we have to make up for those 25. So suppose we produce 25 more units on farm 1. Our costs would then go up by area B, and by comparing these two areas, we can see, we can save area C by shifting resources, by shifting production from farm 2 to farm 1. Okay? So let's try to generalize this then. If the marginal cost on farm 2 is above that on farm 1, what should we do? What's the rule? If the marginal cost on farm 2 is above that on farm 1, what should we do? We should move allocation. We should move production, some production, from farm 2 to farm 1, right? What about if the marginal cost on farm 1 is bigger than that on farm 2? What should we do then? Yeah, which way?
Yeah.
Right, so if the marginal cost on farm 1 is bigger than on farm 2, we should produce less over here and more over here, okay? So this tells us if whenever the marginal cost on farm 2 is bigger than farm 1, you want to move from farm 2 to farm 1. And if the marginal cost on farm 1 is bigger than farm 2, then you want to move from farm 1 to farm 2. How do we minimize our total cost of production? Following out that logic, the way to minimize the total cost of production is to allocate production across the 2 farms such that the marginal cost is equal. Okay? That's how we minimize our production costs. This, by the way, is an incredibly important rule if you're working for a business firm which has several factories. It's got factories in different countries, for example, right? Okay. And you want to ask, well, how should we allocate production across our factories? You want to follow this rule. Okay. Allocate production so that across our 2 factories, the marginal costs of production are equal. That's how we produce in a way which minimizes our total cost of production. Okay. Now, let's look at a much, much more difficult problem. Okay, that was easy. Let's look at a problem now. You're the central planner. You want to allocate production across these 2 farms. But now, let's suppose you don't know the marginal costs. Got no clue. It's Alex's farm, it's Pat's farm. You don't know the marginal cost. In fact, let's go further. Let's say that there is no one who knows the marginal cost on both farms. No one knows this information, the marginal cost on both farms. Okay? How can we possibly allocate production in a way which minimizes the total costs when we don't know the marginal cost of production on these 2 farms? The central planner cannot solve this problem. The central planner does not have enough information to solve this problem. But amazingly, the market can solve this problem. Okay? How so? Well, remember, Alex knows the marginal cost on Alex's farm. Pat knows the marginal cost on Pat's farm. And what does Alex want to do in order to maximize profit? To maximize profit, Alex wants to produce at the point where price is equal to Alex's marginal cost. Pat wants to produce that quantity such that the price is equal to the marginal cost on Pat's farm. But since they're both responding to the same price, if Pat sets P equals MC, MC1, and Alex sets P equals MC2, then MC1 equals MC2. Okay? Neither Pat nor Alex intend to distribute production across their 2 farms in just that way that minimizes total industry cost. Neither of them intends this. Neither of them may even understand that this is happening. And yet, through the invisible hand, this is the invisible hand, that's exactly what does happen. Just acting in their self-interest. Each one trying just on their own to maximize their own profit, allocates production across the 2 farms in just that way that we would want a central planner to do if the central planner had all of this information, which they don't have. So the market is able to solve this problem. And it's able to do so, okay, without anybody understanding that this is what is happening. Okay? So markets were solving this problem, in fact, long before anyone understood the properties of the solution. And it was only economists who can see the invisible hand. The understanding of the properties of profit maximization in a unitary market had to be discovered, that this was actually going on. Now you see, as the price changes, right? The price goes up, okay, as the price goes down, production is continually being reallocated across these two farms, always in the way that minimizes total industry costs. Again, without anybody intending it or even understanding it, the operations of profit maximization, self-interest, allocates production across these two farms in a way that minimizes the total industry costs. So this is really the true importance of the price is equal to marginal cost condition. What it means is that production is allocated across all of the firms in the economy in a way which minimizes that total cost of producing that quantity of output. Kind of an amazing, stunning fact. And no one understands it, no one has to understand this, and no one intends it. This is what Hayek, echoing people from the Scottish Enlightenment, said. This is a product of human action, but not of human design. Okay? If you go back to that video, right, where I said, quoting Vernon Smith, Nobel Prize winner Vernon Smith, right? If the price system had been designed, we would say, oh, this is incredible. It's a miraculous thing that this can actually work. It wasn't designed, though. It evolved like language, and yet it has these remarkable properties. Properties of human action, but not of human design. Okay, so let me summarize then. Seeing the invisible hand. To me, to see the invisible hand is to see all of the worldwide cooperation which occurs right before, under our noses, right? Okay. To appreciate, even when all of the news is filled with stories of conflict, to understand that behind that, right, in all of the products, the smartphones in our pockets, and all of the goods at our supermarket, to understand that behind the surface of conflict, we actually see a tremendous amount of cooperation in the world. Cooperation on the basis of voluntary self-interest, without coercion or central control. Okay. The price system is what allocates goods, not just single markets. So it's important when thinking about what the market system is to think about the big picture, how markets allocate resources, not just looking at single markets, in isolation, but to think about how a change in one market, change in the price of one market, creates these cascading effects as entrepreneurs figure out how to adjust to that change. Okay? How do we now solve, now that this price is higher, how do we now solve the great economic problem, which is to get as much value as possible from our limited resources? Price is a signal wrapped up in an incentive. Okay? Keep these things in mind. Signaling and incentives. The use of information in prices, illustrated with information markets. Think about those prediction markets and how those prediction markets implicitly aggregate all of this dispersed information to create this number which is informative, which tells of things of importance, and which tells of things which no individual knew. No individual knew. But when you just gather all of this dispersed information together, you have something new. You have something which is just a product of all these things being an emergent property. Okay? The prediction is an emergent property from all of this dispersed information being aggregated into this single number, the price. And then to think about the minimization of the total cost of production as a result of profit maximization as an illustration of the invisible hand in action, a product of human action, but not of human design. Thank you very much.
All right, so we have a little bit of time here for questions. Do you have any for Mrs. Tabarrok? As our speaker said last night, you must have given the perfect talk there. No questions, no confusion, right? No, nothing, no curiosities. I'll take the prerogative then. We've seen the prediction market stuff expand, especially it's been around for elections for a long time. We've seen it expand and so forth, and yet, while it's used, it's not how we report information, right? Why do you think that, journalists, which, rather than, and pundits, rather than going out and taking polls and doing all this, why don't they actually just report? If not in conjunction with, right, just say, hey, here's this other way of getting information.
Right.
So why is that do you think they
Right.
report on the prediction markets?
Yeah, so I think it's definitely changing. So now it's not at all uncommon in a newspaper article for a journalist to report, particularly when it comes to these election results, to kind of report these numbers. And there's a lot of discussion on them on Twitter, what happened to the price after the debate, let's take a look. And so I think the informed people do use these markets. But I think you're right that the scope for them is much larger than we're currently using. So one of Robin Hanson's really radical ideas, okay, is to create markets in all kinds of different policies and then use information in those markets to actually make political decisions, to make decisions. So you would ask, for example, we have all these debates in economics. What will fiscal policy, okay, will that, in a recession, will that reduce the unemployment rate? Okay. Well, it would be possible to create markets in these policies based upon, say, the unemployment rate if policy A is passed, and the unemployment rate if policy B is passed, and then you could then see under which market the unemployment, under which policy market participants were forecasting a lower unemployment rate. So you could actually learn what would be the best policy, or what would be the best policy as aggregated in all this dispersed information. Or think about, we have this implicitly sometimes when a CEO of a major corporation, let's say they die unexpectedly, okay? Then you can look at the market price of the stock. And did it go up or did it go down? Right? Okay. If it went down, well, that says that CEO is probably a pretty good CEO. If it went up, that says people were quite happy that that CEO left. So when Steve Ballmer, for example, left Microsoft, the stock of Microsoft jumped way up. Okay, right? like a $1.7 billion higher, indicating that the market thought it was better for Microsoft that he was no longer CEO. Well, you could create a market in if the CEO leaves, what will happen to the price of Microsoft stock? And then you could look at that, okay? And that would give you a measure, a continuous time measure of whether the CEO is doing a good job or not. Right? So there's all kinds of ways that we could use these markets more extensively. There's a lot of, why we don't, is kind of an interesting question. Maybe we fear markets. Maybe this is a little bit too new. All kinds of things. Like maybe people don't really want to know the answer, right? They say they do, but they actually don't want to know, right? But I do think there's a much bigger scope for them that we could still get to.
Other questions?
One more behind you.
How accurate are these markets outside? So you gave us the example of the election. How accurate are they in predicting box office hits or any other use that are currently useful?
Right. So the best answer that I can give is that they're accurate enough that people are willing to spend money to see the results. Okay? So for the Hollywood Stock Exchange, as I said, they created this exchange in order to get this information. So Hollywood thinks that this information is useful, right? And that makes sense because, you know, movies are an incredibly risky product, right? Most movies bomb. Most movies do not make their cost. So any kind of edge which a producer in Hollywood can get is really worth a lot. If you could just increase the probability of having a hit, you know, by 3 or 4 or 5%, that's like a big deal. That's a really big deal, right? Bond traders, when they're looking at who's going to win the election, they really do care about the results. How's that going to affect stocks? You know, if one person wins the election, that might be good for defense stocks. If the other person wins the election, it's not so good for defense stocks. So they care about the results. So the results are good enough that people tend to care about them. But of course, we're not seeing the future. We're only predicting the future. So of course, there's always a lot of uncertainty. And some areas there's more uncertainty than others. So you can't predict everything. Yes?
Do you think that the prediction markets could hinder types of industries like the creative industry, movies, and things like that? Whereas the most profitable, most likely to succeed storylines and actors just give us recycled material, not only with movies, but expanding that to other arts sectors, or also into entrepreneurs not being able to get funding that they need for more crazy ideas because they don't have these prediction models behind them, or even with larger companies scared that their stock valuation will be decreased if they maybe, I don't know, say create a new maybe social program that won't be super profitable, but
Right.
has like a good social impact.
Right.
So do you think that the prediction markets hold us back in that
Right.
way, just relying on the past and not being as creative in the future?
Yeah. So that's a good question. So, you know, when it comes to movies, it's like maybe the problem is not perhaps the prediction market, but if it is the case that people really do want to see the same movie over and over again, you know, Rocky 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, I think we're at now. Okay, I think the last one is 7. If that is really true, okay, then prediction markets will lead you in that direction. However, I think what is actually going on is that people just fear. They don't know what the market really wants, so they go for the safe bet, which is that, you know, Rocky 7 is a safer bet than something completely new. So prediction markets could actually have the opposite effect. It could give people more confidence to try something new. And don't forget also, so I think you're rightly pointing out that there's a value in having lots of different experiments. Okay, it's certainly true, for example, that people open far too many restaurants than they should. Okay, right? Because everyone thinks, oh, it'll just be so fun, you know, and I like cooking, and they don't know anything about the restaurant business, but they like cooking, and they go, and you know, restaurants are just slaughtered, right? New restaurants open and close all the time. Very few of them succeed. Now, perhaps to the rest of us, okay, not to the restaurant owners, this experimentation has some side benefits. We get to try out new things. But to the restaurant owners, okay, it's a disaster, right? And a lot of wasted resources go into experiments which people probably could have known from the beginning they weren't going to work, right? Like if you open the, you know, the 4th pizza joint and there's already 3, it's probably not going to work, but people convince themselves that it is going to work because they're special, but they're really not, right? A prediction market could perhaps reduce some of that wasted experimentation.